Maybe just to warm up the discussion, I will ask questions individually. RORY, in your platform, Sedition, we can see two kinds of art pieces. I would say digitized art and digital art. Can you explain the difference and how you can have a specific strategy to sell the digitized and digital art? Is this the same strategy on the market?
For Sedition, yes, it's the same strategy. The reason for this is the difference on the site between the two is digitized art is, for example, the Tracy Emin neons that you were looking at earlier. They exist as physical art pieces. Now, Tracy had always wanted to picture those or to have those appear as though her hand was writing it magically in the air. So when we first met her and we discussed Sedition, she was really excited about finally being able to exhibit that piece the way she had originally envisaged. But that's not digital art. It's art that's being presented in a digital media. Other artists, Universal Everything, the piece with the walking figure that you saw, and the earlier piece that came from MTV, as Paul mentioned, those were written completely in code. So they were designed in a digital context, written with digital tools and presented in a digital media. That's digital art. Sedition at the moment is fairly limited in what it can actually show. We're showing JPEGs and we're showing movie files. So in actual fact, in terms of what's happening with digital art, there's not a great deal of representation on Sedition for that. We don't have interactive pieces, we don't have generative pieces, and this is something we'd like to do down the line. But we were very aware of the need to have an in, if you will, something that was recognizable, discrete individual things that people could purchase or buy or own and collect and enjoy. And we're very aware that it's a very small slice of the digital art scene, as it were. We're not trying to be everything to everybody. I don't think that's possible. We just want to try and grow the ecosystem and make sure that we can introduce the audience to it. Once we've got that and the audience is there, there's a vast area they can explore. We just want to give them the pathway in.
But you're not selling halves, the hard halves on your platform. You don't have that kind of art.
Sorry,
application. Some artists are doing application for iPad or Android. Yeah. So do you have that kind of art?
Not on the platform at the moment. We do support those things. For example, Universal Everything, who we work very closely with, they produced an app collaborating with Radiohead, the pop group. Actually, I think if they were here to hear me describe them as a pop group, they'd probably punch me. But ultimately, we do support those. We help apps to come about. We don't yet put them on the site and have them there. These are things that might develop over time. We're looking at ways to expand the offering and what's there. So we're certainly supporting that, and we're getting involved in commissioning those works. We're not yet putting them on the site.
Okay. So Dominique, you called your event Variation. So I think you have an idea behind this word. We know that digital art is always dealing with variation. It's variability. So can you tell me more about how much variability or variation is important when people are buying or looking for digital art? Variation as a property of art in digital art.
There are different ways to think about variation, as I already said. This is the name of one of the 9 evenings by John Cage. And you know that the 9 evenings were one possible beginning of what is happening right now, and we saw it at ICA recently, thanks to the exhibition Electronic Superhighway. Jeremy Ballet exhibited there, and a lot of other artists. And we can think about one possible beginning at the end of the 60s, because 3 moments were very important. ICA with this exhibition is electronic cybernetic serendipity, the 9 evenings East Coast, and another art project West Coast, all of them 66, 67, 68. And Variation was a performance of John Cage, who took advantage of the technologies of the moment, meaning, for example, the telephone, not the cell phone, but the telephone, thanks to Bell, laboratories, and there is an interesting story about it, because at Bell Laboratories, at Bell, the standards, they didn't understand why some people didn't hang up the telephone, so they finally hung up all the telephones, so finally it had an influence on the performance. And they at this moment used the emerging sensors, radio, telephony, and all these technologies. And I understand that you are also talking about variable media that recently have been mostly named media archaeology. And these two ideas from the 90s, 2000, and the 2010 are linked together. And of course, what made difficult for the artists and some galleries like Steve Zaks or you and some other to sell art is that during the 90s we were interested in the idea of this variability of the media, and we were a little afraid of knowing that maybe in a few years, in a few decades, some artworks would disappear. And I would say that it's not a matter of it's not only a matter of digital. If we would consider, for example, Damien has a lot of works that are disappearing right now. So I think that it's maybe for the new generation of collectors not that important. I would mention Hampus Lindwall, that you might know, who is an art collector from Sweden, moving from Paris to Brussels, and who has some websites, a lot of net artworks. And sometimes he has to call the artist and say the artist, hey, by the way, your Flash animation online doesn't work anymore, for Rosendal, the example. Could you try to do something? And the artist, of course, move one technology to another, meaning HTML5. But I think that there is I'm sure I know that there is a new generation of collectors that accept to buy some artworks, not for a very, very, very important amount of money. I'm not talking about millions. I'm more talking about 10, 100, even thousands of dollars. And by accepting that, they might disappear. And one day I met a curator in France who told me, you know, Dominique, in a few decades, most of these things are going to disappear. And we have to maybe accept that sometimes there are artworks that disappear. But we also know that this is a contract that sometimes makes the artworks, the contract. And we also know that there are artworks that disappear or that are disappearing. I'm talking about performances. I'm talking about conceptual art with the contract, and I'm talking about land art. And finally, in certain ways, documentation of this variable media, of these variable artworks that are disappearing or reappearing. If you talk about Robert Smyson and the Spiral Jetties that disappeared and reappeared. So maybe we will see some artworks that disappeared because we don't know how to emulate some O2 system of the 90s right now, but maybe we will be able to reactivate these artworks in 10 or 20 years. 10 or 20 years. So I would finish to say that documenting is very, very important, and you know that as an artist because you document your work, and your work is also made of some documentation in a certain way. But there is documentation and there are instructions. And I know for sure that instruction, if you're talking about the variable media, the fact that the artwork we're talking about are variable, the instructions are very important to know that even when the artist is dead, the instruction written by the artist make possible to reactivate their work over different ways. I'm not sure that Nam Yoon Paik, for example, he documented his work, but he might not have given instructions. So nowadays it's not that easy to reactivate some Nam Yoon Paik of the early, of the end of the 60s. But I think that Cazares, for example, that you know and that you exhibit, who is also a coder. I'm pretty sure that he's thinking about this kind of possibilities to make his own code possibly reactivated in 20 years or 30 years, maybe differently, but by writing some instructions.
But also, my question is about how variation or variability gives a value to art. It's a new value. Before, art was static. You can keep it as it is at the beginning when you bought it. So now people are looking for something that can change. So this aesthetic value, how can you introduce that in the market and respect the need to have variability?
Yeah. If I knew, I would do it. No, I mean, the variation is also a matter of showing all of these possibilities. I'm really interested in the question of the medium, and if you look at these 50 past years, we know that all of the most important media of art, sound, video, radio, transmission, and etc., have been contaminated by the digital medium. And I'm finishing a PhD, as you know, by talking about the multiple digital practices of a singular contemporary art, because I consider that there is one art nowadays that is only contemporary art, but there are different ways to look at it. And there is no one medium, there is no media, there are no innovations, there are no tools, there are no services that are not possibly becoming art thanks to artists that are bending these technologies, bending this media, bending this medium. So my fare as a curator is definitely some kind of exhibition where I want to establish some relationship between all of these different media, but thanks to their coefficient of digitality. And I will finish with a sentence of again, because I'm an art critic, Marcel Duchamp, who once talked about the coefficient of art in any object. And my PhD advisor, Norbert Hiller, converted this sentence by talking about the coefficient of digitality of any artworks. And I would say, finally, to end, that even a painting, even a sculpture, not 3D prototype and whatever, has a digital coefficient in itself. I mean, because we know that even a painter would maybe look at Google, use Google as a research engine to finally get some more ideas. So there are no artworks without any digital coefficient nowadays, whether they're online or not.
Thank you. Walt, I like the depth, the historical depth you brought in your presentation, and you are working with the very first pioneer of digital art, like Manfred Mohr or Vera Molnar. They are maybe the first one working with computers, and I would like to know how time can give value to art and digital art, because we are always talking about, it's a new media, but they are not new artists. So they're in art since 50 years or 40 years. So how time can give value to digital art in a way?
Well, that is already happening, because I just mentioned at the end of my talk this whole phenomenon of post-internet, that these young artists who have basically grown up with the internet are dealing with it on a totally natural basis. It's just one medium which affected drastically their life, but which they don't recognize as some major difference. Due to that, some younger artists are really hyped right now on the market, which means doing really well, at least for now. We will see what happens, but that's that's the game, you know. That's how it works. And the consequences were that many institutions are now really looking at the history of it as well. So I'm now in contact with SF MoMA or LACMA or VNAs anyway, for a long time already involved in that. We are in contact for very long times, or Pompidou. So many institutions, we had this show just in the Whitechapel, which was more or less a one-off thing because the curator went off somewhere else and had different plans, but still it's an indicator which shows that as well these early people are validated. And as well, which I find very important in their context. Yesterday we saw this picture from Solevit. I don't know who it was. It was the first keynote, I think. He had this picture with the squares. That is very much related conceptually to what Manfred Mohr does. I mean, he has taken it to an extreme. For the ones of you who don't know this work, Manfred Mohr is one of the earliest pioneers besides Vera Molnar. Both started in Paris in 68, 69 to work with a computer, but Manfred didn't want to make it too complicated, so he only works with cubes. Well, it's getting more complicated because he actually computes them into 13 dimensions, which means mathematically it's not, you can't imagine. But he basically develops very complex structures which are just lines and flat surfaces. So at the beginning there were many aesthetic and conceptual connections with that. So no, I have no doubt that that is really a nice acknowledgement for me as well, for this work over 20 years with these people, to see that they are now really recognized and put into place.
Thank you. Any question from the public?
I try in English. My first question is for you. As a young artist, if I subscribe for free to your website and show my things, what are the engagement of the artist? Is there any exclusivity clause or things like that? And secondly, how if we sell something, what is the repartition? What we receive as the artist?
We've modeled that fairly closely on the gallery model. The revenue split between us and the artists on the site is 50-50. When we first, and this is an anecdote that I like to roll out frequently, not normally in a situation like this because I'm to some extent preaching to the choir here, but whenever I'm talking to journalists, and there's particularly with figures like Damien Hirst and some of the very successful artists, there's often a focus on money, on finance, and these kind of telephone numbers that some of the works end up selling for. And I think the general public gets quite caught up with that. But actually, when we founded Sedition, the artists agreed an 80-20 split in our favor in order to let us recoup the investment costs. And I always like telling people that because it completely undermines this idea of money grubbing big names who are not, they were there to support other artists on the site. They're very well aware that the big names and the big sales that they're doing were supporting emerging artists and people who are stepping onto the scene for the first time, and they were very happy to do that. They were also very happy to support us in setting up the project and to forego the money for that. But now that that's done, the split on the site is 50-50. In actual fact, the way that happens is it's not 50-50 of 100% of the revenue. It works out to be around 90%. There's transaction costs, VAT, this kind of thing taken off the top first. The other question you asked was not... yes. Yes, a certificate, yes.
And what it means in terms of under the certificate for the artist?
Of course, the certificate, as I said, is something of I believe, a slightly unnecessary thing, particularly if we end up moving on to things like blockchain technology and things that will happen down the line. But in terms of exclusivity, this is slightly different. We ask, again, this is not the first works. The first works we started with were recognizably visible in a digital format as well as a physical one, and that was a deliberate choice. Nowadays, if you put something onto the site, unless it's a documentation of a physical piece, it's almost always built and created in digital media just for Sedition. That's the exclusivity we ask for. I don't want the same work to be available in 100 different formats and in many different places. Then we can do it, but we need to make it very clear that it's available in another place, and it should be in a slightly different format or something slightly unique to the platform. I don't look to represent artists exclusively, and that's important to me, because we really want to make sure that we're adding a resource for artists, a place where they can meet other like-minded creators and come up with different collaborations and different ideas, a place where they can come to ask for advice on a marketplace or introductions to other gallerists. I'm not looking to restrict their relationships at all. If they're on Sedition, then they can work with however many other sites and however many other galleries they want. Many of the galleries now have kind of got used to the fact that we're not competing on the same turf. If a request comes in for a physical artwork or something that we don't do ourselves, we'll pass that request back to the artist and back to the gallery, so we can act as a useful funnel of information for them. So the galleries now come and actually sign up artists for us themselves, because they recognize that we gain a wider audience and can help promote and act as an echo chamber to their own projects. So that's very important. Whilst I look for exclusive works, I don't look for exclusive artist relationships. I want the artist to be able to work with as many people as possible. It's better for them, and it's good for us.
So I think we can find all the details on your website. Yeah, okay. Another question?
Okay, I have a question for Wolfs. Okay, I liked the historical perspective you've given to the galleries and things like that. And I think in a way it made it very coherent that your gallery is in a way modeled after a museum. You somewhat bring the history context in the museum. Could you talk a bit more about that? Because is it a statement about how, or is it meeting a need for a history of digital art? Because you do it really in the platform, and it's an awkward model in the gallery context to model it on the museum. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, the gallery is in the end really a classical gallery. The connection is, of course, that I represent artists from the early periods, like the very early pioneers, 60s, 70s. In this field, I'm probably the only one who's representing most of these artists who were beginning pioneers. And then I have other artists from this Middle Ages, net art, 90s, and so on, and contemporary work. The purely online museum was, as I mentioned already in my talk, was the intention to make this information available. At that time, it was not possible to inform yourself about digital art and how it all began and where it came from. And I realized when people understand what there is already historically behind it, that it will be much easier for them to sell or to buy something as well. Because they could look up Manfred Mohr and they could see what he did in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. And they see there's a career and there's some line going all through this. So that's what I thought was really important, because I spoke to museum directors at the time. I mean, I was naive at the beginning. I went to make an appointment with a museum director in Frankfurt and wanted to show him digital art. And he was not interested because, I mean, just to give you an idea, 20 years ago, the biggest magazine in Germany, Art it's called, it really has a publication of 70,000 per month. Yeah, it's really big for an art magazine. It titled, "The Computer is Making the Art." Which is, it can't get any worse, you know, because the idea that the computer is making art is ridiculous. It is always the artist with his vision or his genius behind it who works with this medium, who creates something which is different or has some kind of effect on you. But as a professional magazine in this field to write something like that, so you could see how far away they were, even professional people in this field, from this whole topic. That was the background why I started it that way. And then, I already mentioned it a little bit, then in the last 10 years, the scene has changed a lot. So I was pulled into the gallery game more than I wanted. But I mean, somehow you need to make a living. So I'm now going back to these other activities, like the award and the online museum, to build that further and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
First of all, thank you for the presentations. I have a question for Mr. Lieser. You briefly talked about, sorry, art fairs. Yeah, you briefly talked about art fairs. You said that galleries are not selling. Are you specifically talking about digital art or contemporary art in general? Are they...
regarding art fairs?
Sorry.
Regarding art fairs?
Yes, regarding art fairs. Like apart from the previews, obviously.
No, I think there are only a very few activities besides what you have done so far in the field of art fairs for digital art. There was an activity in Munich, it's now more than 2 years ago, which got some response, but to put that in perspective, per statistic, 80% of everything which is sold on the art market is painting. 80%, right. So then we look at sculpture, photography, video, drawings, and all this enormous other media, which are all small niches. And then that digital is really a very tiny niche. Even, I'm totally sure that is the medium which is influencing the 21st century, like photography or a TV did in the 20s, right? I mean, it's obvious, you will see. It's happening very fast and quickly, and it's everywhere. But still, from the art market, from the art scene, especially from the market, it's very, very tiny. So I think an art fair dedicated to that, and you will probably confirm that regarding sales, it's still quite difficult. I mean, I'm okay because I'm in this field for such a long time, and I'm really well known. If you put in digital art on Google, you will find us. But generally, this is very, very tiny. I mean, photography took, I mean, it's not comparable. Photography took 150 years before it was established on the art market. Now we have communication mediums, and we have a time where artists want to be successful with 30, right? That was not like when I started. You accepted to have a career, build it up, and maybe make some living decent with 40 or be successful. Now they want to have it right there. So we are. But no, I think it's. There are other art fairs who tried to include sections, like Arco did that for a while. Istanbul, an art fair did it for a while. But I think it financially didn't pay off.
Can I add to that? I don't know if this is your experience as well, but something that gets talked about a lot in these kind of forums is digital art versus contemporary art versus whatever art. In my experience, almost none of the artists that I work with consider themselves to be digital artists or any other thought. They just consider themselves to be artists. The pigeonholing and the categorization tends to happen amongst groups like us, largely because I think it makes it easier to navigate and to work your way through it. Most artists don't see it that way at all. And also, as a side thought, it's incredibly important that people like Wolf have actually done what they've done with DAM and the Digital Art Museum, because I've had the same experience with museums, curators, the official artist or art structure and underpinning, the academic underpinning to everything that we do, has to some extent, or was to some extent, kind of caught on the hop with digital art. It happened, it arrived, and no one really knew how to deal with it, how to present it, how to archive it, conserve it, so much so that we're still discussing this today. And without, I mean, art is the history of mankind. The story of art is the story of humanity. And without someone to make sense of that and to put it into context and to tell that story in the right kind of, the right narrative, it's meaningless and it won't be documented and kept hold of, which is why projects like DAM are so important.